Well, thank you, Lisa Brower, for that very kind introduction, and thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to meet people. John Goodwin, of course, who I've known for a long time, who's very kind in inviting me in. It's been a pleasure to meet Marilyn and Jim Hebenstreet and a number of the trustees. I'm looking forward to meeting with more of you chat with more of you later. It is a special pleasure to be here at the Linda Hall Library. I will say that, full disclosure, in addition to currently being a professor of neuroscience at Princeton University, I am the child of librarians. And so, in fact, in Indiana, I spent childhood at Indiana State University, many pleasant hours in a science library. And so that science library, when I was small, seemed like a very big place. And it is a pleasure coming back to a place where I, as an adult, can still feel that the library is a very big place. And so thanks for having me. It's wonderful to be here. So here's what I'd like to do tonight. My mission, I believe, is to talk about the developing brain. As I said, I teach and I run a research laboratory at Princeton University, and I've been there for 18 years. And I'm interested in how brains grow in infancy, childhood, and in adulthood, all the way to adulthood. And actually, it turns out that I got interested in this both because of my laboratory research and also because of imminent parenthood. And my wife and I discovered we were going to have a baby. I was very pleased about this. We decided, and we were good academics. My wife is an academic physician. I'm a researcher. And like any good academic, what I did is I waited till the last minute and crammed. And so then I go to the bookstore or I go to the bookshelf and I discover all these books about children's brains. And it turns out, but they weren't labeled that. They were labeled things like healthy sleep habits, healthy child, or things like that. And so it was all these books about children's behavior, children's learning, and so on. And what I thought was, these are really books about the brain. Like sleep is about the brain, learning is about the brain. But what I discovered was that there was no book that was really explicitly, at least to my thinking, that really captured modern neuroscience and what we can know about what's happening inside a child's head. From conception all the way to college. And I thought that was an interesting topic. And so I will just say that this led to me understanding children's brains a little bit more. I wrote a book called Welcome to Your Child's Brain, which I am not going to try to sell you afterwards. But I assure you that it is a good book. And so, so I wrote a book, Welcome to Your Child's Brain. And so what I want to do tonight is mix two different topics. I'd like to talk about regular brain development that virtually all children go through, and then I'd also like to kind of go off to the side and take a little detour in the middle to talk about how brains can go off track. And so just to give you the big picture is that children inherit their DNA from their biological mother and father. Development is largely self-administering. There's not that much that we need to do, for the most part, to help our children's brains grow. They thrive under a wide variety of circumstances, and they're like dandelions, as it were. They just grow like little beautiful weeds. But there is also the fact that, in fact, brains can sometimes go off track. And then brains can go off track because of genetic reasons or environmental reasons. And so what I'm going to try to give you tonight is an idea of brains being driven by a genetic program, driven by experience, like rain falling on flower seeds, but also how it can go off track. And I'm going to put autism in the context of regular development that virtually all children go through. And so I'm going to try to put those two topics together. It's going to go back and forth a little bit, so I'll ask your forgiveness in advance for giving you a crash course in child-oriented neuroscience, starting from regular development, going off to autism, and then returning back to the main path. So that's what I'm going to do tonight. That's our adventure. Okay. So speaking as a neuroscientist, the kinds of things that we care about in the laboratory are these things. I'm using my pointer of my computer here. I hope you can see the little arrow. Can you see it okay? Okay, good. So, so these are the kinds of things that we talk about in the laboratory, or in the classroom and so on. We talk about genes, the bits of DNA that we inherit from our mother and father, development, and so there's a program that gets turned on by those genes. Experience and environment. And experience and environment can be anything, including the things that a baby experiences when she comes into the world, the kinds of things that happen when mom and dad talk to her. It can also include nutrition. It can include schoolmates, peers, and so on. And so these are the kinds of things that we talk about when we are discussing brain development as scientists. But over here, I just want to show you, these are really the kinds of things that we care a lot about, that all of us care about, whether we're scientists or not. And I just want to mention them as all being the outcomes of what the brain does. And so going from genes, development, experience, and environment, there are all these things that I think all of us care about in our children, in our loved ones, in ourselves. And they are things that, there we go. Personality, memory, identity, and these, of course, memory and identity are very much linked to each other, and brain function, both with typical kids, and also dysfunction when function goes off track. It can go off track in early life, as in autism, depression, schizophrenia, later in life, dementia, and Alzheimer's disease. There are all these ways that brains go off track, but I'm going to present to you that, speaking as a scientist, one needs to understand what happens when they're on track first, and then that gives us a proper way of understanding what happens when they go off track. So that's what I'm going to be doing tonight. Okay, so just to acquaint you with brain development is this remarkable process that here 25 days after fertilization, 5 months after fertilization, and finally at birth, through this whole process, this process before birth is mostly automatic, mostly is driven by a genetic program, until at birth the brain weighs about 1 pound. And so it's this little 1 pound brain that comes into the world ready to learn. And our brains, when we're adults, are typically about 3 pounds. And so there's this little thing that's about 1 pound in size that contains the potential to learn from the world. Now, I think as we all know, babies come into the world not knowing a whole lot, but what they do know is that they know how to learn. Babies are these remarkable learning machines that are able to take experiences that they can't predict. They come into the world not knowing what is going to be there, except they know a few things. They know that feeding is good. They like breakfast and lunch and dinner. They like deep touch. They like being hugged. But other than that, babies have very few expectations about what they're going to encounter in the world. And so they basically take those fundamentals that they innately like, and they start building on those things, learning from the world around them. And that learning process is what babies are incredibly good at. And so just to give you a sense of it, here's just an example of some babies, some small children learning. You can already see that these children are actually learning by seeking out their own experiences. This is a preschool center where I live in Princeton, New Jersey. There's a little boy here playing with a truck, and then there is this little girl, the most beautiful girl in the world. She's just a darling little girl. She's fantastic. Isn't she beautiful? So this little girl, who's now 10 anyway, but this little girl, so you can see innate toy preference already in this boy playing with the truck and this girl here playing with the doll put on a little blanket. So the question is, are these innate preferences, or do children seek out these things? And I just first want to give you a little bit of evidence that whatever we may encounter later in life, some of these preferences might actually be inborn. And let me just show you an example from another species. This is now another species. This is now vervet monkeys. And this is a female vervet monkey. This is a male vervet monkey. And you can see here that the male vervet monkey appears to be moving this car along the ground, right? So this boy monkey is doing that. This girl monkey is doing an anogenital inspection of the toy doll. Okay, so it's like looking for mites or something. Who knows what? We should not even ask what it's looking for. But the point is that these are monkeys that have not spent time watching TV. They really haven't spent that much time, say, learning gender roles, and yet they still seem to have these innate preferences. And this is not, okay, so I have to be careful about what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that these are the fates of boys and girls. What I'm saying is that we are born with desires and preferences, and that's our starting point. Where we end up can be a lot of places. But I think it's helpful to remember that there is a starting place that boys and girls begin from when they're very small, and this can include other species as well. And I just want to put out there the idea that we all have a starting point, and that's something to think about as we think about brain development. Now, it turns out that boys and girls are surprisingly similar, so there's lots of things we like to talk about boys and girls being different from one another. But surprisingly, boys and girls are really more same than they are different in many ways. And this is just a little cautionary tale, because you might find in pop psychology magazines, you might hear that boys are more aggressive than girls, or maybe girls have more, are more relationship-based than justice-based. But this is just to show you, these are statistical distributions, and without getting too into the math at all, there's a way to measure how different the average is. It's called an effect size, and when an effect size gets to be about 1 or so, that's a really big difference where you can really tell individuals apart between one group and the other group. And so you might read in a magazine that on average, encourage boys to decide based on justice or rules, girls decide based on relationships. And certainly these are stereotypes that we might have of boys and girls, but in fact the difference is quite small, and so the distribution of boys and girls is quite heavily overlapping. And so it's not at all surprising to find a girl who's interested in deciding a conflict based on rules, or a boy who decides based on relationships. Even something where we say that there's a substantial difference like aggression, not rare to find an aggressive girl or a boy with good motor coordination. It's only in very few domains, just a very few specialized domains, that we can start seeing differences between boys and girls. The slide I showed you before is the biggest known boy-girl difference is boys like tools and guns, girls like dolls. I have a colleague who really wanted to break down gender expectations with her boy and her girl. She's my colleague over in the psychology department at Princeton University, and she tried to give her girl trucks, and she gave her boys dolls. The girls, she found the girl having a tea party with the trucks. And she found the boy with the doll pounding a nail. Okay, so, you know, these preferences are hard to undo. Differences that you might encounter in adulthood, on average, mental rotation of objects is something that men are good at, and women are good at object location. And so, for instance, you know, in a couple, a fairly typical interaction would be, "Where did I leave my keys, honey?" the man says, and the woman says, "Right where you left them, they're on this place," right? So that would be, and then on the other hand, men are good at object rotation. And so, for instance, if you're trying to get a couch through a doorway, right, or around some stairs, it's better to ask the dumb guy than the smart woman, okay? That's how big a difference it is. And so, you know, I don't mean to stereotype, but it is true that there are some things, but it's surprising how many similarities there are between men and women's brains. And I think that we, of course, focus on the differences because we're obviously very interested in the differences between men and women. This is something that comes naturally to us more and more over time. So let me talk a little bit about the idea that, now that I've really impressed upon you the idea that we have a starting point, now I want to work on the other idea. So first I've given you the idea that we have a starting point. Now I want to give you the idea that environment affects us. And so we start with some place that we begin based on genetics and sex, and then we start building up effects in the environment. And let me just give you an example. This is our quintessential example. My book co-author on Welcome to Your Child's Brain, Sandra Ammett. Sandra and I wrote this op-ed. Normally you find things on the New York Times op-ed page about war or politics, but we snuck in some science. And what we did is we wrote we wrote an op-ed on the solstice in 2011, and we wrote a thing called "The Sun is the Best Optometrist." And the idea is this, that even if there's biological potential, environment can play a really important role. And I think you probably can't read this from the back room, and I'll just read it to you a little bit. So the idea is that, for instance, susceptibility to nearsightedness is a thing that's genetic, and yet it's environmental. Now, how can that be? So the case study that we published, or that we wrote about, was the idea that if you look at 7-year-old children of Chinese ethnicity living in Sydney, Australia, and in Singapore, these are kids who come from genetically similar backgrounds. And the rate of nearsightedness in Singapore was 29%, almost 3 in 10. The rate of nearsightedness in Sydney, Australia was 3%, 1 in 30. So why is that? 1 in 30 versus 3 in 10. Why is that so different? And it turns out that if you look at a bunch of other evidence, most of the evidence is consistent with the idea that if you have a genetic susceptibility to nearsightedness, what that means is that you need light to help the eyeball decide when to stop growing. And so eyes, lenses, cornea, the eye grow, and it stops growing based on signals that it receives from the world. And it turns out that in what looks like about 3 out of 10 Chinese kids, those 3 out of 10 kids seem to require natural light. And there's a strong correlation between how much outdoor light kids get in Sydney and Singapore and how likely they are to become nearsighted. So you might wonder, like, lots of your friends are nearsighted. Like, why is it that so many people are nearsighted? Wouldn't you think that would have been a problem 500 years ago? Why would I have not, I don't know, I'm 8 diopters. Why would I have not been 8 diopters in a rice paddy in China? Well, the answer is that I would have been outdoors all day, and my eyeballs would not have grown to be the beautiful elongated eyeballs that I have now. So the general idea is that nearsightedness is a quintessential example of something that is genetic and yet depends on environment. And the reason I'm going off about this is that a lot of traits in the brain are both genetic and environmental. It turns out that IQ is both genetic and environmental. And this can explain differences between populations, for instance, of kids who grow up in poverty. That would be an example of environment playing a pretty major influence on IQ, yet it is also true that there's a strong genetic component of intelligence. And so it's really hard to separate those two, and we're not really able to separate them in individuals who we know. So that's just another example. Personality is also something that is both genetic and also environmentally influenced. You can see this even in raising dairy goats, where goats are born as twins, where one twin, they're identicals usually, and if one twin is raised by goats and the other is raised by humans, the goat who's raised by humans is kind of the equivalent of being raised by wolves from the goat's point of view. And so it turns out that the one who's raised by humans is way more social and more interested in novelty than the one who's raised by goats. And so these are just examples in which personality and so on can be influenced by our environments. Okay, so why is this all true? The reason this is all true, and I just realized that I should look at the time because I'm certain that, I'm way behind. Okay, good. And so the reason for this is that the growing brain is this organ that shapes itself, right? Brains find their own experience, and they do so through these little connections between nerve cells that are called synapses. And so you have something like 100 billion brain cells, and each one of them forms an average of 1,000 to 10,000 connections. Those connections are how we form our personalities, our memories, and so on. And one thing that's interesting about children's brains is that this is a graph where it's impossible to see the axis because it was a figure that was drawn in 1990. And so if you look, this is the number of synapses in a brain. This is done by looking post-mortem. And this is the number of synapses from before birth, neonatal, ages 2 through 12 months, and then ages 2, 5, 10, 20, and then here's a 70-year-old here. And what's interesting here, to me, is that the peak number of connections in the brain happens around 10 to 12 months of age, right? So before 10 to 12 months of age, children are forming something like an average of about 5 million connections per second. And after the age of 10 to 12 months, the net change in synapses is losing several million synapses per second. And so that's funny because if you think about synapses, maybe you think about synapses as how information is stored. It turns out that babies, children, are losing synapses at the same time that they are learning an enormous amount of information from the world. And so this crash in number of synapses, think of it as like a topiary, where what the child is doing is taking experience and trimming away connections to find the statue that's inside her brain, right? So just going like this to find out who she is. And so really children are learning this. And so losing synapses is not the same as losing knowledge. And of course, we continue to gain knowledge throughout life. And so just because this point here is lower at age 70 does not mean that there's a problem when you get into your 50s and 70s. It is instead is a part of the normal process of pruning away connections. You're not getting older. You're getting better. All right. So let me now apply some of this to the subject of autism and talk about that a little bit. So far I've talked about how normal brains develop and exactly how a normal brain comes to mature in children. All of these same principles that turn out to apply to autism. Now autism is something that we've been hearing about much more and more in the population, something like about 1 in 50 births currently in the United States, according to the Centers for Disease Control, lead to a diagnosis or, are associated with an autism diagnosis by age 2. And so really it's being more and more recognized. And I want you to think about autism as a disorder that consists of 2 major features. When kids end up on the spectrum, the 2 major features are aloneness and sameness. And so sameness means maybe the kid likes to have the same toy all the time, maybe gets upset when she's taken or when he's taken to school by a different route. Aloneness means not really playing with other kids, having difficulty communicating. And these 2 traits, aloneness and sameness, are major traits of autism, and they really define it. So where does autism come from? Well, it turns out that we have a few clues that we can look at, and I just want to just mention a few of them, and we can get into discussion and get into the details of this. But one thing that's come up in the last few years, and this has come up over and over again, this is now an article that was in the International Journal Nature, which of course the Linda Hall Library subscribes to. Who knows how many subscriptions to Nature the Linda Hall Library has. But if you look in this really beautiful article in Nature, they looked in dozens and dozens of kids who ended up being diagnosed on the spectrum. And this is now, horizontal axis is age in months from 0 months to about 4 years. And then this is the volume of different brain structures. This is the surface area of the brain. And this is the thickness of the sheet that is composes the brain. And in each case, the red thing here is the average of autistic kids, and the blue here is the average of neurotypical kids. And you can see over and over again, there seems to be something that's greater in the autistic kids than in the kids who are neurotypical. Now, why is that? Now, I've told you that connections get pruned away in kids from age 0 to 6. And so it looks like what could be going on here is that pruning process is slowed down. There's something about the pruning process in autistic kids that on average doesn't go as quickly as in neurotypical kids. And so if we put these things together, then we might suppose it's possible to imagine that what babies are doing, what children are doing, is learning from the environment. And there's something about learning from sensory experience that doesn't really quite get translated to pruning in autistic kids on average. And so there's something going on here that's a subtle difference, but it could be a difference that might be at the core of what constitutes autism. Now, the kinds of things that we know about autism are as follows, and I've just for the interest of time, I've left out a graph of data. It pains me to leave out data, but I left out some data. And I would say that this is what we know right now about brain development, which is that there's refinement of wiring in the brain. That refinement happens best at certain times during development. Those certain times are called critical periods or sensitive periods. So an example of this would be if you speak a foreign language, if you learn that language, say before the age of 6, then you typically will have a wonderful, perfect accent. If you learn between 6 and puberty, then maybe your grammar's okay, but your accent isn't so good. And if you learn after the age of 12 or so, then you will probably have noticeably foreign accent and grammar. And so that's an example of a sensitive period where you have to have the experience of the language at a certain date, at a certain age. And so my colleagues and I, this is a review article we wrote for a major journal, Neuron. My students Alex Kloth and Alexandra Badura and I wrote an article in which we supposed that sensory information coming in from the world might guide the developing brain, this green lettered thing, the association cortex, and we suppose that this process can go off track. And we suggested that the process can go off track because of genes that are a little bit different in some kids, because of stress, perhaps at birth or prenatally during the mother's pregnancy, or environmental influences. And it turns out that all these influences exert their effect before birth. And so as far as anybody can tell, every known risk factor for autism occurs either at conception through DNA, and that is the major cause of autism, or steps that happen before birth or perhaps at birth. And basically, none of these steps occur after birth. And so the idea is that this process of learning from the environment can go off track in different ways. And that's a fundamental idea that I think encapsulates a lot of autism research. And we can certainly talk about that during discussion. So let me give you an example of something that autistic kids have a tougher time doing than neurotypical kids. And I'm going to just show you this. Can you see the little dots in the back of the room? Is this sort of okay? Let me play this for you. So here's what we're going to do. This is a man, and he is playing with a doll. And he's a demonstrator, and we're going to hear some audio from him. And these little lights are lights that are strapped onto him to capture motion. But we don't see him, we only see the lights. And the reason for doing this is that it's capturing biological motion without capturing all the details. And what these researchers did is they did this classic study that's now almost 10 years old, where they said, okay, can kids associate this movie of movement with the audio track that goes with it? And their control is they said, okay, here's the regular movie, the guy doing the demonstration. Here's the same movie played upside down and backwards. And the idea is that what we're going to see here is the eye movements of the child. This little green plus is the eye movements. This is a regular kid. This is a toddler with autism, and this is a developmentally delayed toddler. And what I want you to look at is compare this one here, see where he looks, and this kid with autism, and see where he looks. And I'm going to play the movie now. Is the sound, let's see. All right. All right, so we're going to play this now. Let's see. I hope you can hear it.
Johnny. Hey, Johnny. Look, it's Teddy. Do you want to play with Teddy? Teddy wants to play with you.
That kid's having no trouble.
Hi, Teddy. How are you doing? Yeah, Teddy. Johnny, look. Teddy.
And this kid is going back and forth.
Teddy needs a hug. Give Teddy a hug. Teddy, do you want a hug? Teddy wants a hug. Teddy. Johnny. Hey, Johnny. Look, it's Teddy. Do you want to play with Teddy? Teddy wants to play with you. Hi, Teddy. How are you doing? Yeah, Teddy. Johnny, look. Teddy,
okay, so did you all see that the kid with autism is looking back and forth a lot, and the typically developing toddler had no trouble fixating on the regular movie, nor did the developmentally delayed toddler. Did you all see that? Okay, happy to show it to you again afterwards. The idea here is there's something about linking up two kinds of sensory information, visual information of biological motion and auditory information, and kids who are on the spectrum seem to have some difficulty. And if you think about that, you could well imagine that it would be really hard to learn about the world if you couldn't link a biological event happening in front of you with the sound of it. If I'm, talking with my baby and I say, "Oh, honey, how are you doing? What a nice baby you are. What are you doing there?" If I'm talking to the baby, if the baby has trouble linking what I'm saying to me being in front of the baby, that could be a real impediment to learning about the world. And you can imagine that would be a process, that would be an impediment that would make it really tough for kids to learn about the world. And no matter what kind of loving environment that kid gets, it's going to be really tough for the kid to learn. And fundamentally, that idea that I just gave you is consistent with a fair amount of what is known about autism. Now, I should say that autism is this enormous and exploding field, and there's a huge wealth of knowledge, and I've only captured this little tiny fraction of what's known in autism research, but I would say that one idea that's really animating a lot of researchers in this domain is this idea that learning from sensory experience is tough for kids who are on the spectrum. And you can imagine that in an extreme situation, that would be pretty difficult. So here's a really heartbreaking case study. This case study really told us as a field how important it was to have normal sensory experience. This is a photograph of a Romanian orphanage. During the Ceausescu regime, the communist leader Ceausescu correctly said that human beings were the greatest resource of a nation. And he therefore reasoned from that everybody should have lots of babies. And this was irrespective of whether parents had the resources to raise those babies, and as a result, in the Ceausescu regime, there were a lot of abandoned babies. And it turns out that kids who were abandoned and put into these orphanages often didn't get loving care, didn't get anything but basic changing and food. And these kids were much more often than the general population, these kids ended up on the autism spectrum. And so we now know that severe neglect, extreme neglect of the type that you would never find in a normal home, that kind of extreme neglect can also lead to a risk of autism. And what that tells you is that there's this genetic range, genes set a range of possibilities, and the very bottom of the range can include autism. And so this is the thing that we also know about how genes and environment work together. Okay, so I've gotten done telling you that autism has a strong genetic component. It turns out there's hundreds of genes that have been found all over the human genome. We don't know what most of these genes do. A lot of them seem to involve synaptic signaling, so many of these genes appear to encode proteins that are responsible for communication between neurons. But fundamentally, we've only found a fraction of all the genes that may increase the risk of autism. It turns out that we're all carrying around these genes. A lot of these genes are common variants, and they don't by themselves lead to autism. And so it appears that a substantial fraction of autism is driven by the combination of genes. And this is why autism can be genetic, yet parents who are not on the spectrum can yet have a child who is autistic. And let me just give you an example of that. This has a very interesting consequence, which is that you can see traces of what autism genes might do in those of us who are not autistic. And so here's just an example. At the time that I made this slide, the reported rate of autism was lower in the US population. And this is from a survey of college undergraduates. And you can see in the general US population, the rate of autism at the time was about 1 in 160. Siblings of humanities and social science majors at several major universities, a slightly higher rate, but that's probably because there's multiple siblings per family. But here, there's something like a 3-fold higher rate of autism in the siblings of science, math, and engineering majors. So that's funny. And what it suggests is the possibility that there's something that makes us more likely to like technical subjects. And that same something, in a different context, might make us more likely to be autistic. And so, what that something is, I couldn't say, but it might be something like being interested in rules or in objects as opposed to being interested in people. And if you think about why people enter technical subjects versus entering a humanist subject, you can well imagine that people have different reasons for picking these different kinds of things. And so, for instance, I'm a technical major, right? And so I'm in this body of people here. So I'm just going to give you a real brief test right now. Don't worry, this is you won't be scored on this. So I'm just going to give you an example of how these traits may influence both who we are in our intellectual interests and also who we are genetically. And so I'm going to give you this little test. I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my mouse here. And so the test is this. Think about all your first-degree relatives, your children, your siblings, and your parents. No cousins, only first-degree relatives. Full siblings, parents, and offspring. And now think about all those people, and if one of them is autistic, then score -1. If one of them has depression, +1, bipolar, +1, and substance abuse, +1. And so that should give you a score that's anywhere between -1 and +3, right? Okay? Now, what did you major in college? So if you major in natural sciences, you're here. If you majored in humanities, you're here in yellow. Think about your score, -1 to +3, +2 actually, and think about your major in college. And you know, most of you are inside one of these large rectangles, right? Not in one of the small ones. If you have autism in your family and none of these mood disorders or substance abuse, then the likelihood is that you were probably a technical major. Now this is not a certainty, right? There's like 400 of you here, and so ballpark about 40 of you are going to come up to me afterwards and say, no, I wasn't in that rectangle. Okay, so you know, that's okay, all right. Come up as a group. Don't do it by one. Okay, so, but the idea here is that there seems to be something in us that leads to our normal intellectual diversity and also leads to these outcomes that can cause developmental problems. And this gives us this little insight as to why do we go around carrying these genes that lead to these things that can be problems. And one possibility is that as a species, it is helpful to be diverse. There are times when you need humanists. There are times when you need engineers. Sometimes it's time for a song or a poem or a speech or some kind of inspiration. Sometimes you need to get the bridge to not fall down. And depending on what's needed, the society needs people who are interested in these kinds of things. And so if these genes that lead us to be interested in different subjects also lead us, in some cases, to go have developmental problems, then one can well imagine that that's why those genes stick around. Is that okay? That kind of makes sense? Glad to talk about that a little bit. Okay, so look, I'm running a little bit low on time, but let me now get back onto the regular track. I've talked so far about early life development. I've talked about autism and how development can go off track. And now I want to fast forward and just talk about childhood and adolescence and really get into that a little bit. And this is starting to get into the domain of things that we can do to influence our children. And so this is now a little bit of news you can use. So let me just talk about the idea that all these things that we learn, facts that we learn about the world, abilities that we learn, it turns out that one of the things that we can learn is self-control and willpower. And it turns out that willpower is like a muscle and it's like memory. We can expand it by practice. And so I just want to spend a couple of slides talking about the idea that willpower is something that can be expanded by practice in us and also in our children and our grandchildren. So let me just talk about that a little bit. So it turns out that there's an excellent peer-reviewed literature on this topic. Adele Diamond and Kathleen Lee wrote this wonderful article a few years ago in Science magazine where they said, here are some interventions that aid executive function development in children 4 to 12 years old. Executive function means planning for the future, exercising self-restraint, knowing what to say or what not to say. Now, if you are experienced with children 4 to 12 years old, you know that children who are 4 are not so good at this. And you know that people who are 12 are often much better at it, right? And so what is it that happens in the brains of these kids as they get older? It turns out that there are things that are happening, like the frontal cortex is growing. I'll show you a movie of that at the end of the talk. And it turns out that there are interventions that have been shown to improve outcomes. There's Montessori education. I was speaking with somebody earlier at the reception. I was speaking with someone who's an educator with Montessori experience. Turns out that Maria Montessori was a pioneer in this domain, and she gave kids toys and activities, but she made them wait in line. They had to take turns. They had adult things in their environments, but they had to wait and they had to learn to control themselves. Recently, some researchers have followed on one of the greatest psychologists who ever lived, Vygotsky, whose ideas I think in some ways are greater than Freud's ideas and much more well supported by empirical evidence. Vygotsky said that children are learners who learn from their environments, and it turns out that researchers have started to look into ways in which kids can learn from exercising self-restraint. An intervention where when it's your turn to talk, you get a stick or a picture of a face talking, or maybe when it's your turn to listen, you have a picture of an ear, and so you have to take turns talking and so on. Kids who get this kind of tools in the mind treatment before age 4 come out by age 4 more ready to learn to read, better at vocabulary, better liked by their peers, and get along better with their teachers. And so they get along better with other kids. And so it's not just an academic pursuit, it's actually getting along better with other kids. And so there's something that is being built in these kids' brains. And then this is just an example of an intervention that you can do later when a kid gets something like Taekwondo. Again, that self-control that helps build executive function. Okay, so why is this happening? Well, here's a movie of brain development. And this is now human brain. This is a composite movie of kids in early childhood through early adulthood. This is the back of the brain. This is the front of the brain. These executive functions depend on frontal parts of the brain, the frontal cortex. And what I'm going to show you is a movie where when it's purple or dark blue, that's when the brain has reached maturity. And this is now a composite movie starting at age 6 and going through age 16. And you can see here, oh, I hope it plays. Okay, so here's the back maturing first, and the maturation moves to the front. I hope you can see that the back matured first, and then the front turned this nice purpley kind of color towards the end of the movie. I'll play it again. Back first, and then the front. And so this is a process that goes on from childhood through adolescence, and even in our brains, even as we get into our 20s, 30s, and even our 40s. And so there's something that changes in our brains where the prefrontal cortex grows, the connections between different parts of the brain, that's called white matter. So the white matter grows. And so there's something that's happening in our children's brains as they get older. And that's just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that are changing in a kid's brain. So when you look at your 6-year-old, or you look at your 12-year-old, or you look at your 16-year-old, there are things that are happening in that child's brain that look like what's going on in this movie. Okay, so as I said, kids, I should mention that kids find their own environment. So a lot of what they do is exercise self-restraint. Anything that a child is so interested in that he or she will do it on their own for many hours at a time is a good way to build up self-restraint. Hobbies are a good way to build self-restraint. And you can see these two girls basically building their self-restraint by having an elaborate game where they have to sit with the teacup, and this rock is probably meant to be a sweet or a roll, but it's actually a rock. Anyway, no, it's a roll. And so these kids are having a tea party, and what they're doing is they're actually building self-restraint. And so when children play games, the more elaborate the game, the more complex the game, the more they're building up this self-restraint muscle inside their heads. Okay, so this depends, as I said, on frontal parts of the brain. I won't get into it too much, but there's parts of the brain that in the front that were in that movie that are really the source, the physical mechanism by which these things arise. So now, I'm just going to end by talking about adolescence just a little bit. Now, we think about adolescence as something terrible and stormy, but actually adolescence is just a continuation of the same process. Adolescence is a wonderful time when kids learn about their physical capabilities, their mental capabilities. There are things they discover about themselves that they couldn't do before. Learn languages, take risks, think about more complicated things. Adolescence is actually an amazing time in a child's life. But of course, it's not without its troubles. There are also changes in emotional stability that happen, and it's quite often that bipolar and depression start to first become apparent in adolescence, also things like schizophrenia. And I just want to end by talking about things that can be helpful in kids in their mood, and also can be helpful in all of you as adults. And I'm just going to say that in addition to things like things you might think of when you go to the doctor, like getting an antidepressant, it turns out that one of the best interventions for both adolescents and also adults for mental health is physical exercise. And if you remember, earlier I showed you those bell curves and I showed you effect sizes. If those of you are very numerically oriented, you saw that a big effect was something like an effect size of 1. It turns out that one of the biggest effect sizes comes from physical exercise. The effects of physical exercise on depression are as powerful as those of taking an antidepressant. So basically, getting on the treadmill, improving your cardiovascular health, exercising, is good for you, and it's good for your children and for your grandchildren. And I'm just going to give you some federal government guidelines. This is from the Department of Health and Human Services. And if you look at these consensus guidelines from people who are experts in the domain, they show here health benefits of physical activity include things that you've heard of, like heart disease, stroke, high blood pressure. All these things can be addressed by physical activity, but also reduce depression and better cognitive function in older adults. If you're getting older and you feel yourself maybe mentally slowing down a little bit, these are activities. Physical activity can help arrest that slowdown. And likewise, in children and adolescents, there's also evidence that physical exercise will reduce symptoms of anxiety and depression. And so these are things that are good for us and also good for our children. And I just want to give you that as an example of an intervention that can have a powerful effect that can actually improve your children's lives and your own life. Okay, so I'll just wind up by saying that, of course, all of this is made possible by federal funding of research. My students and my laboratory is a machine that takes your taxes. Thank you very much. It takes your taxes and takes less trained people, and we produce knowledge and we produce better people. And this is part of what makes the United States such a great nation when it comes to science. And I just want to show you this lovely aerial shot for those of you who did not go to Princeton. Some of you went to other institutions. They're okay. They're okay too. But this is our Genomics Institute in this white building here. This is psychology and this is neuroscience. And if you're ever on campus, I invite you to drop by and visit us at the Princeton Neuroscience Institute. And I will stop there. Thanks very much.
We have time for a few questions. Raise your hand. I'll come by with the microphone. We have a worldwide audience watching via live stream, so we want to get the audio of your questions on the live stream. We'll start up front.
Hi, thank you for speaking this evening. Just wanted to get your take on how drugs and alcohol affect an early child or maybe a middle school child and all the development. How does that play out in the long run?
Yeah, so there's two things, drugs and alcohol and how they affect the developing brain. So there's two things going on there. One is that when at very early stages of development, brain cells are being born, and brain cells are produced during pregnancy and at birth, maybe a little bit after birth, but most of the brain cells are born at that time. And of course, synaptic connections are being formed and unformed, as you saw. So one thing that's very important to understand is that drugs and alcohol can affect those processes. And in particular, alcohol toxicity can exert pretty powerful effects. I mean, I think you've probably heard of fetal alcohol syndrome, and that's just an example of something that can happen. So just to extend the idea a little bit, it's not just drugs and alcohol, but it's also things like severe stress. So for example, if a woman is pregnant and is caught in a hurricane strike zone and is displaced or is otherwise traumatized by being in a hurricane strike zone or a natural disaster, the odds of the kid eventually ending up on the spectrum, autism spectrum, are about doubled. And so it's not just drugs and alcohol, but it's also intense stress. And so I think it's really important to understand that these early stages of development are quite critical in a baby's development. And so, this has kind of folksy consequences, like in the third trimester. It really is a good idea to take it easy a little bit. If anyone's going to be having the stressful experience, it is the husband's job during the third, because it turns out that the husband's bloodstream does not send stress hormones to the developing fetus. Sorry.
Yes, thank you. I'm a dermatologist, and I've observed that with kids, until about age 8, you really have to have some control over them to be able to do a procedure, and even if you're not hurting them, they will yell and scream. But after 8, you can talk to them rationally, and they will respond and let you do what you need to get done. What's going on in the brain that's changing from pre-8 to after 8 that might explain that?
So this is a good question. So why is it that kids seem to have more control over their pain responses as they get older? So this gets back to what I was saying, and I kind of glossed over it a little bit, development of prefrontal cortex and brain maturation. It could be in the frontal cortex, it could be in other parts of the brain, but the capacity to exert emotional control and control responses improves with age as these frontal structures grow. So for example, just in our lives, we know that like if you touch a hot stove, right, your impulse is to jerk away from the stove. But if you are an adult and you pick up a teapot and it's hot, you don't drop the teapot, you go, ah, and you put it down slowly. And that's just an example of a kind of control that we all have. And if you think about what a 4-year-old would do in that kind of situation and a 9-year-old, there's a difference in the response. So what's probably going on there is that there are emotional responses in brain regions that are mostly mature. So I can list some regions for you, like the amygdala, which controls powerful emotional responses. That's pretty much at adult size by about 8 or 9. But the prefrontal cortex is not finished developing even into the 20s. And so what's going on there is that there are some brain regions that are mature, ready to go by age 9. But there are other regions that are important for executive function, and they really take more time to persist. The general principle is that brains develop from the back to the front, from birth through the 20s, and that back to front development culminates in these regions that are important for executive control. Is that
Well, it's very nice that you brought out the amygdala because of the pain and fear part of this too. And it seems to me, isn't that kind of correlated with logical kind of thinking or not?
Well, I mean, to get away from the neuroscience a little bit, psychologists, cognitive scientists have come up with, my colleague at Princeton, Daniel Kahneman, has this framework for thinking about fast and slow thinking, where we have one kind of thinking that's just intuitive and immediate, and that's our immediate response, and then we have slow, deliberative ways of thinking that take a little more time. And if we give ourselves time to engage in that deliberative thinking, then we are able to come up with a different kind of answer than when we just have our rapid answer. And his general framework is that he calls them system 1 and system 2. I would say that it is often the case that we have a rapid response, and it's not always the same brain regions, but like amygdala might be important for a relatively rapid response, but if there's more time, then these frontal regions might become more engaged and have time to start exerting their influence on the response.
Professor Wang, we have a question in the back of the room.
Yep.
Okay, so you said that physical activity is supposed to relieve depression and actually have positive mental health, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so I actually know someone who developed depression through being active in sports, and my guess is the fact that maybe the performance wasn't high enough, so maybe that's why she developed depression, or something along the lines of that. So do you think my guess is right, or do you know why that perhaps physical activity wasn't something that did relieve her depression, but instead strengthened that?
So broadly speaking, there are biological events that are known to be associated with exercise. They involve the secretion of a molecule called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. There's the growth of the input structures to neurons. Those are called dendrites. And so there are events that are known to happen that are associated with intense exercise. In your friend's case, I couldn't say. One thing I'll say is that exercise is sometimes a mixed bag. An example of a kind of exercise that can actually lead to adverse brain effects is contact sports. So whether it be football or lacrosse, sports that are associated with head injury or concussion can sometimes lead to problems with head injury. And broadly speaking, I would never really recommend a contact sport for someone at that stage. In your friend's case, I really couldn't speculate.
We have a question on your left, towards the back of the room.
Is there any statistical information about any differences with multiple births as opposed to single births? I mean, twins, triplets. Have you noticed anything that is statistically different with those with multiple births?
So you're not talking about birth order, but you're talking about kids like twins and triplets. Yeah, I think those effects are relatively subtle. This is not a domain I know a whole ton about, but broadly speaking, developmental disabilities do not seem to be present at higher rates in identical twins and fraternal twins. So for example, when people look at the genetic part of autism, when they look at fraternal twins who have as much genetic similarity as kids born at different ages, the genetic and environmental contributions seem to be about the same. And so that suggests that there's not very much risk associated with multiple birth. There can be exceptions to that. One exception is when you start throwing in more factors such as prematurity. But broadly speaking, multiple birth is not a major risk.
Yes, could you comment on screen time in children and brain development? Do those things relate or don't relate?
Yes. When children, so screen time. So an example of a product that was once used to help children developmentally is a thing called Baby Einstein, right? These videos where you put the kid in front of the video and the kid watches the video and just watches for an hour at a time, and that's supposed to be good for brain development. It turns out that so-called baby DVDs are associated with slower rates of language acquisition. Now, why would that be? Well, the influencer is an hour a day of baby DVDs appears to be associated with slower language acquisition. And it turns out that, if you think about that, well, that's an hour less a day of human interaction. And so broadly speaking, screen time, I would say, think about it this way. What brains do often? They do well. And if a baby spends a lot of time or a small child spends a lot of time in front of a screen, then they're going to spend a lot of time getting good at that. If I spend a lot of time with this, and I'm doing this a lot, I'm pretty good at replying to email. but I might not be quite as good at detecting a situation and figuring out what to do about it. And so broadly speaking, I would say children get practice at what you let them do. Broadly speaking, kids don't really have such good self-control mechanisms. We were talking about this threshold that seems to arise around age 8 or 9. This is why the American Association of Pediatrics does not recommend television for kids who are, say, I forget what their age threshold is, but it's basically before the age of 3 or 4. They just say, look, TV is just a super bad idea for kids who are very small. At a later age, kids can handle it. It turns out that the slowing of vocabulary doesn't happen when you let kids watch like Sesame Street or grown-up TV shows. Although these days with the news, they learn all kinds of other words, but you probably don't want that. But broadly speaking, yes, screen time is something to think about in terms of a kid learning to do whatever she's doing while watching the screen.
Professor Wang, back here towards the back of the room again.
Yes.
I'm going to try to pull two things together that you mentioned, one in your talk and one in an answer to a previous question. You showed us systematic differences in the building and paring away of synaptic connections between normally developing children on the autistic spectrum.
Right.
You also mentioned the greater prevalence of autistic spectrum disorders in children exposed at very young ages to great traumatic events. My question is whether that systematic difference has to do with the mechanism of paring away those connections, or with the timing. And in that connection, whether the timing has something to do with the chemical environment in the brain or the development of the endocrine system, and whether that might be reflected then in your answer to, or in your comment on kids, for instance, who went through Katrina.
Right. So let's see. So your question has so many levels to it. Let me talk about this. So broadly speaking, the thing that we know most securely as a field, the field of autism research, the thing that's most known, that's best known, is that probably the great majority of causation of autism begins genetically. And so what that means is that fundamentally, these combinations of genes, just like as you get dealt cards from a deck, you get dealt your hand, and certain combinations have special meaning, just as when you play bridge or poker, there's certain combinations of the cards that carry a special meaning. And autism seems to be the same way, as well as other developmental outcomes. I think a big mystery right now that a lot of people are working on is trying to understand how those genes get turned into what cells do and what brain regions do. So if I'm going to list a few brain regions that seem to be important in the causation of autism, the cerebellum comes up. That's a brain region that I study. It's a region that seems to process sensory information to help teach the rest of the brain. Yeah, and another region would be the striatum. And so there are regions that seem to be important, and they turn up over and over again as people start to understand how genes get translated into brain function. Getting back to your question about how traumatic events may affect the developing brain, that is not known. It is a growing field of research to understand how stress affects not just adult brains, which we hear about a lot, but stress hormones and stressful experiences can also affect the developing brain. And that is something that's really a growing field. And in some ways, one of the most exciting areas of neuroscience right now is understanding these developmental events and how something like a stressful experience or other experience can get converted into long-term change. And I apologize for not having a concrete answer for you, except to tell you that it is a growing field of study.
Professor Wang, up here on your right, about midway in the audience.
Thanks. Okay, your presentation was absolutely marvelous, and we certainly appreciate you coming here and sharing this information with us. I'd like to make a comment for the thing where the woman said, well, I know somebody who had exercise and they had depression. Well, if you exercise too much and you put a strain on your body, then yes, that can affect your mind. Also, if you're trying to be competitive and get, certain things accomplished, and maybe it can also factor in. My daughter, she was very sick for 2 straight years, and the only thing that made her feel better was to exercise. So even when it was snowing, she'd go out and walk, and she wasn't doing this for anybody else. She was doing this because this is what her body told her, and this was the only thing that gave her body a sense of relief. So I think that exercise is like everything else. You have to look at it in the context of how it's used as to how it's going to affect your brain and the symptoms of depression. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment.
All right, I know there are a few hands up, but due to the time, let's do one more question, and we'll do it back here. Professor Wang has another commitment tonight, and then he's got a 4 a.m. car service pickup, so we need to
It's okay, it's
end
5
on
o'clock
time.
back home. It's fine.
Would you please comment on the concept of the connection between autism and vaccines?
So epidemiologically, perhaps the single most studied factor in the biological causes of autism is, in fact, vaccination. And just to pick an example, the MMR vaccine has been studied, I forget, about 10 to 15 times. And the median amount of increased risk associated with vaccination and autism is 0. And so as far as anybody can tell, the effect of vaccines on developing brains is basically none. Based on what else is known about the biology of autism, it would be actually kind of surprising, because vaccines are typically given at age 1 or age 2, and every other piece of epidemiological information about autism causation suggests that there's a window of vulnerability that starts at conception and goes through the 3rd trimester. And what that means is that something that happens at age 2, unless you get stuck in a Romanian orphanage, basically a single event where you get stuck is basically appears to have no causal relationship with autism. It turns out that the person who originally reported that falsified a fair bit of his data, has been stripped of his medical license. He's a person named Andrew Wakefield, and so it appears that the original evidence for that is fraudulent. Now, that having been said, there are certainly people who are suspicious of vaccines who don't want vaccination. But as far as I can tell, this is an idea that began with a movement that was against vaccination and then led to that belief based on a fraudulent study.
All right, thank you, Professor Wang. And thank you for attending tonight's Bartlett Lecture. This is our 16th Bartlett Lecture, and it just seems to get better every year. So we hope to see you here again next year, if not sooner. Thank you and good night.